If I asked almost anybody in the world, who do you think is the most famous scientist ever? I'm sure almost everybody would say Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein is a very interesting guy. I think to understand Albert Einstein, there are some important dates that we can look at. Firstly, 1906, 1914, 1919, and the 1930s. Firstly, he published his theory of relativity in 1906. But interestingly, it didn't go according to plan. Imagine, you're Albert Einstein and you have just published probably the greatest work of physics ever. But after publishing it, there was silence for 6 months. One of the reasons for this is because at that time, Albert Einstein was not a physicist. He was working as a patent clerk for the government. Anyway, he waited 6 months and there was no reaction. He waited and waited, and eventually he decided that he had to prove his theory of relativity. Basically, cutting a long story short, the way to prove the theory of relativity was to wait for a total eclipse of the sun. But, as you may know, total eclipses of the sun don't happen very often. And they happen in different parts of the world. So, after waiting a few years for some kind of reaction and not getting any reaction, he decided to prove his theory. And he calculated with astronomers the next eclipse of the sun, and the next eclipse of the sun was 1914. And where was it? In Russia. Now, imagine, the year is 1914, and German scientists set up their equipment in Russia to try to prove the theory of relativity. But what happens in 1914? The First World War starts. Now, Russian soldiers come into their camp and they find German scientists with the technological equipment in Russia. So, they could not prove the theory at this time, 1914. And Einstein had to wait until the end of the First World War. Anyway, he calculated again, and the next solar eclipse was 1919. Anyway, the guys went to the solar eclipse, they took the measurements, and they proved his theory of relativity. Now, Albert Einstein became famous, because after proving the theory, the physics community couldn't deny it, they couldn't neglect it anymore, and he became a superstar. Now, after that, he became more and more famous, and during the 1920s and 1930s, he gave a lot of lectures in American universities. There was one time when he had given so many lectures at the universities, traveling from one city to another. He was exhausted, and his driver looked in the rear view mirror, saw one night that Einstein was really exhausted, and the driver said, "So, Mr. Einstein, I think I can give your lecture. I have watched it so many times, I have memorized exactly what you say." So, Albert Einstein said, "Oh, okay then, why not? You go in there and you do my lecture on the theory of relativity." So, the driver, this is a true story by the way, the driver goes onto the stage and he delivers Einstein's lecture, exactly the same as Einstein would have done it. But at the end, as you know, there are questions. and a professor at the back asked a difficult question about the theory of relativity. Now, the driver looked at him and said, I mean, of course, nobody knows he's a driver. Everyone thinks he's Albert Einstein. In the 1930s, people didn't know him. So the driver said, oh, that's such a basic question. It's so easy, even my driver could answer it. So he called in Albert Einstein, who gave a perfect answer to the question.